Okay, well, thank you. I just wanted to get a sense of that because this is our fourth in the series of the seminar talks. And we have, more or less followed some methodology in terms of putting this together. So the first one with Regeneron really looked at a company from its early founding with its technology all the way 29 years later to its success, after launch of its compound 5 years ago. Then we started from the beginning, if you will, and we really looked at bench research and moving into preclinical. And then the third series, we looked at preclinical going into the clinic. And our panel this afternoon is has great expertise as serial entrepreneurs in terms of bringing assets through clinical development to launch. And they have successfully exited some early stage technology. So the focus of this seminar really is on the development of the business plan, working to create your team, and very importantly, being able to attract investment dollars. So that's what we're going to focus on. So why don't I go ahead and ask our panel, starting with Mark, to introduce yourselves. And if you could talk a little bit about your own career journey. I think that most in the audience, faculty, postdocs, maybe some medical students, always appreciate hearing a successful person's career journey. And don't stop at just one job. Please give us the whole arc, but in a sound bite.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we're going to encapsulate 30 years in a sound bite, right? Ups and downs. No. So I could be regarded as a fraud here because I have a philosophy literature major, and then I got an MBA, and I didn't actually get into biotech specifically until I was 34, and yet here I am pretending that I got the knowledge here as one of these guys. So I think the common thread was that I always felt like I wanted to be idealistic and work in a profession that was going to leave something positive behind. And so in my 20s, I worked in not-for-profits, variety of not-for-profits. And what ultimately drove me away from, say, state government in North Carolina or trade association of scholarly book presses, university presses here in New York, was just my sense of the calcification of bureaucracy. I thought that was big corporate America at the time, long hair, beard. And I had to find out on my own that, in fact, it was potentially worse. It couldn't be any worse. And so I went to business school, I got out, I worked at Bain, and then I joined Biogen at a very sort of fruitful inflection point there. They needed some people to do portfolio prioritization and write the storyline, which I think is the subject here, is what is your storyline for products and what's the trajectory and the arc of products. So I got put on one product that ultimately got commercialized as the head of that development program, and then I got put on what became Avonex, which is Biogen's first product, one of the first multiple sclerosis drugs on the market, the market leader for a long time, and with now $35 billion in cumulative revenue. So to say that was a good ride and a lucky ride would be understating it. I got put in charge of the program, then I got put in charge of North American launch and was head of commercial, then I was head of international and was running 65 countries of sales at Biogen by the time I left. But I left Biogen because I think my own sense of mission was diverting. We were now battling market share and answering to a quarterly investor demands for this many more cents of earnings, this many more 0.2% market share. And the idea of working on transformational products and changing patients' lives was a distant sort of third or fourth in terms of agendas. So since then, to sum it up, I've had 6 different CEO gigs where I've entered a company at an inflection point where they needed to transition from an earlier scientific CEO to a sort of a mid-stage or later stage or commercially minded CEO. And I've been involved in antibiotic companies, cancer vaccine company, diagnostic imaging for heart attacks, and then most recently, immuno-oncology. And I regret nothing.
Very good. All right, moving down the line, Ron Newbold. So Ron, a lot of the theme here around precision medicine initiative and this focus is also looking at the New York ecosystem and cultivating more biotech entrepreneurship in New York. And Ron, you hail from New Jersey and currently works for Pfizer, and you've sat on both sides of the fence, so to speak, as well, including currently. So if you could give us some of your background.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I'm currently responsible at Pfizer for a variety of activities that are very much in this sort of startup company ecosystem space. I'm responsible for global scouting, which means that we're looking across all our therapeutic areas for licensing opportunities, for clinical stage assets that we could bring in and partner or market. But also making early stage investments. I'm head of a seed fund at Pfizer where we'll invest in companies just as they spin out of academic labs and become very nascent but real companies looking to advance a platform or to address novel target needs or unmet medical needs. I've gotten here through, I think like most of us, a very unpredicted route. I was a chemistry major. Trained as a synthetic organic chemist as a graduate student. I did a postdoc at Harvard. I went to Merck in New Jersey and was a medicinal chemist there for a few years before I moved into business development. And without really knowing where that may be leading, I was very interested in exactly this space, sort of what is drug development about, drug discovery about. My initial role in the licensing BD role at Merck was about finding technologies to better enable Merck's infrastructure so we could do higher throughput, more efficient drug discovery, everything that everyone takes for granted today, things like high throughput genomics, combinatorial chemistry, which people may remember from nearly 20 years ago now, all the proteomics and genomics technologies that were booming, and in the mid-90s, really the boom of real small companies being developed around enabling technologies. So I had the benefit, the luck of being in a place and at a time when this was an exciting opportunity. And after Merck, I worked on a variety of acquisitions. I got my MBA at Columbia while I was at Merck. I moved out of Merck and went into biotech, and I was head of business development for 3 different small companies. One was a spin-out from Columbia. It was called Centricity Biosciences that Richard Axel had founded here up near Columbia Presbyterian. Another company called IRX Therapeutics, which is still in New Jersey. And I was head of business development there and did a big partnership around a brain cancer vaccine, a therapeutic vaccine with Pfizer. And then a third company in the deuterium chemistry space that was looking to make better molecules with better ADME properties. That was based in California, but I have always lived and worked from New Jersey and still do today, even though I come into the city fairly frequently. So.
All right, and Cameron?
Yes, thank you. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming here today and spending some time. I would like to invite you to consider something that you may think of as rather grandiose right now. But here it is anyway. The next couple of hours could be the most important in your life so far. And let me explain why. You are, we are, all of us are, where we are in our lives right now because of the decisions that we have made up until this point. So if you make the decision to take one idea from what you hear over the next few hours, it may be from the panel, it may be through questions, it may be in the hallway, take that one idea that will have the biggest impact on an area of your life in the next 30 to 90 days and execute against it and see if my prediction holds true. That may be in a financial area, it may be your career, it could be personal fitness, it could be personal relationships, it could be giving back, it could be a whole load of things. But if we could perhaps agree, soft contract between us and you, that the intentionality is to have impact and lasting contribution from the next few hours, then for me, that's time well spent. I feel like I will have earned our huge honorarium. But seriously, I would like you to feel that you've also spent time well. So, I'm Cameron Durand. I'm currently the chairman and CEO of a public company called KaloBios, a very troubled company, and I'll tell you a little more about that. My career background chronologically is I graduated med school in the UK at the age of 22. I practiced medicine and saw patients for 8 years, and I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for 26. So I'm 56 years old now. I started my career at Merck in a commercial capacity, sales management, as a rep for a period of time. At that time, everyone in Merck just about came in as a rep, and then went into marketing. I then went to Glaxo, which was Glaxo Wellcome at that time, before it became GSK, ran the hospital business for the UK, my first P&L, and then went into a global role and launched a form of lamivudine for chronic Hep B, which at the time became the biggest selling foreign multinational product in China. China at that time was thought of as an emerging growth market. After that, I got recruited by Pharmacia Corporation, now part of Pfizer, and that's how I came to the United States 17 years ago. So I was global head of infectious diseases for Pharmacia, and then went into a staff role as head of global planning, strategy, and operations. At that time, Pharmacia was the 8th largest global pharmaceutical company. After some time of the Pfizer transaction, I became a spec pharma CEO. I got into a startup pediatrics company, which we developed and sold after 3.5 years. And while we had some business success and grew from 5 people and about $40,000 worth of sales to 125 people and $25 million worth of sales, the thing that I'm most proud of is that we were voted the best place to work. And I really believe that organizational culture is a business enabler. I had a stint back in Big Pharma for almost 3 and a bit years. I was the global head of infectious diseases at Johnson & Johnson, and I've been a spec pharma CEO 4 or 5 times over now. So KaloBios, when I came in, which was just over 1.5 years ago, was in bankruptcy, had filed for Chapter 11. The company had been delisted from NASDAQ. The former CEO, Martin Shkreli, who some of you may have heard of, had been arrested. The company was facing multiple lawsuits, class action lawsuits, and many others. Had no products, no pipeline, no money. The board had imploded and management had scattered. I thought, even I can't make this any worse. So the kind of lesson is startups and turnarounds give you the kind of experience that you will never find in a more stable situation. And I would invite you to consider whether you're a person that runs to where trouble is in order to try and fix it, or whether you would rather kind of go about your other daily business. And the other kind of person is, just to mix metaphors, one that sees a fire and has a bucket. And in that bucket, you choose whether you have water or whether you have gasoline. And some of you work with people that have gasoline all the time. Don't be that person.
So how many in the audience are thinking about a startup? Okay, and I know we have a few that are already in an early stage company, and okay, terrific. So I guess, Mark, thinking about your experience, what advice do you have for the folks that are thinking about going into a startup?
I think everything that these gentlemen have said is absolutely true, and I cherish the opportunity to get back into existentialism with your challenge, right?
You're welcome.
Pull out my Kierkegaard, but seriously, I think in my experience, it's going to be important to have both the raw startup capability and the continued guts and intestinal fortitude to continue to do that, to run in towards the sound of trouble, as the Marines ad says, rather than away. But it's also going to be useful to have the pattern recognition that can come from being at a larger company. And they don't necessarily have to follow a particular sequence, but I think these folks and I have both worked, I think, on both sides. So you see the advantages of understanding a process and getting a toolkit that you can actually use to help. So it's not just all the children's crusade. But then why have I chosen the latter part to be almost universally companies, well, all universities, less than 150 people? Because I think that's where you can, to me, get the most job satisfaction, exert the most change, have the most dedicated group of people. I'd love to test the theory, and see if we could, move mountains with a group of 5,000 or 10,000. But in my experience, it just it's a lot tougher. So I would say think about the startup as not necessarily the end, but as one of the experiences that you're going to need, so you can look back and say, maybe at the third startup, I've had these experiences, and now the leverage that I'm bringing to the table is enormous relative to the first time. But don't shy away from it. Just think of it as part of a step in the career.
Yeah. And Ron, since you sat on both sides, what's your counsel?
Yeah, it's interesting kind of thinking back on why you made certain decisions, why opportunities may have come before you in the first place based on what you've taken on and things maybe you've avoided or didn't find satisfaction in. I went into pharma because I thought that was the best place to learn the most about drug discovery. And, as Mark said, I think I was interested in the field in the first place and I think all of us have this passion that we want to help people. We want to improve health. We want to improve the human condition. We want to help kids with, untreated diseases. And I thought pharma was the place where you could learn the most of that. I think when I came out, when we started in the field, I think that was true. I would say it's a very different biotech environment today. And I think, I've had the benefit without sort of formally having mentors, but people that I've looked up to in a variety of jobs and situations, whether they were my boss or not, but tried to take from different people that I felt were good at their jobs, were good at managing people, were good at inspiring activity, those attributes and sort of things that I wanted to learn or take on. And as I think about what you need to do in a biotech setting to lead a young effort, even if many companies today are a couple people and it's a virtual operation where you outsource much of what you do. It used to be if you had an operation like that, pharma would think you're not a real company. Today, that's almost expected, and we try to run our own projects in a virtual manner like that. So I think the interesting thing when I left Merck and went to my first biotech company was, you kind of grow up in this great environment where you have all these resources, you have a business card that people recognize, they want to call you back if you had called. You go into a small setting, people have no idea who you are, no reason to call you back, but you realize that you can do a lot of things on your own. And that was something I learned here in business school as well, is you don't need all that infrastructure and all that support. You just need ambition, you need motivation, and you need to find like-minded people. And I think you find that in small company environments. Everybody recognizes everything has to get done somehow. Just because you're the CEO doesn't mean you can't drive me someplace or go buy food for guests that are coming in, whatever's required. And so I think if you have that kind of mentality and mindset, you really can present a very professional face to a partner or a buyer or a potential collaborator. And it's a very different time today. So I think that's exciting.
So I think, Ron, you're starting to launch into the area of your story. You have to have a good story to tell. And what do you think? I think Cameron likes to tell a good story. So Cameron, let's start with you. And, you're putting together your presentation. Maybe it's KaloBios, maybe it's another company. But, what is the hallmark of a really good story to get investors and potential partners excited about the promise of your endeavor? What are the ingredients?
So I think you have to know your audience. It seems self-evident, but really research your audience and tailor to what you believe the hot buttons might be. You can do a lot of web research. You can talk to people that have been funded by those organizations, see what they like, what they don't like. I think there's something around how many layers of detail to put in. Sometimes with scientific founder-based presentations, there's a lot of technical detail. You need to explain what is the pain point that your technology addresses, and how can you get to value inflection points. Obviously a buzz phrase that many of you are familiar with, but you really need to define what is that value inflection point, how do you get there, what's it going to cost, how long is it going to take, and to be realistic about it. Because if you are fortunate enough to get funded, the color of money might look the same, but it's not. So the people that you attach yourself to as investors, knowing who they are, particularly when things get tough, how they work with you is very important. It's all a love fest when you get the money in, but you're going to have tough times. And resilience and emotional fortitude, clear thinking in difficult situations is very important. That's not necessarily part of the storyline crafting, but it's another element to consider if you're serious about considering embarking upon an entrepreneurial adventure.
So Ron, give us a sense of some of the worst pitches you've seen. What would you tell the group? What should they not do?
Okay, so I have a few. Actually,
In your Pfizer seat, I would imagine you're going to.
well, Pfizer or Merck, I'll say from the buy side pitches from folks that are starting companies and trying to address some of what Cameron said. I think it is important that small companies think about, why would you want to deal with us? You have to think about competitive positioning. Who else? Hopefully you're the only one that can do what it is that you do. But I have seen cases where usually you want to address an unmet medical need. You might want to be best or first in class if it's a therapeutic, or have a technology that will enable a biotech or a pharma to discover those kinds of products. That's really what we're in it for. Even when we make investments, we're not looking to make money. We're looking to be engaged in an opportunity that will bring products to market. But I've seen companies approach this, or entrepreneurs really, people trying to figure out what is their story and say, and do the math in a funny way, right? Try to solve a problem in a way that is way beyond reality. So we're going to, these are, a lot of them are pretty basic skills that you would learn in building a business, or you go to business school, basic economics. We want to address a particular therapeutic market. We believe we can get 90% of the market, right? Very, very, very unlikely. Okay, but that might be part of it. Or we're going to get you a drug to market faster because our technology is so enabling. And because we're going to get it to market 1 year faster, and it's likely to have at least $1 billion of sales, you should be probably paying us about $1 billion, right, for saving you that year. I've literally heard a few pitches like this where they sort of are equating for certain sales against perceived savings in time, and then thinking that we should share the revenue in that, when there's so many things that go involved in, that are involved in development and discovery and investment, of which the small company typically does not have the resources to invest. And I'm not saying this from, I know everything as a buyer, because I've spent a lot of time selling technology from the biotech side, but I think you have to be realistic. You have to know the audience so much that you recognize what is the problem that they can't fix that you can with your technology. How enabling will your product be, and how will it help patients? And if that's the case, we pharma should be very willing to share the fruits of that, the benefits of that product, the time savings, if there is a time savings. We might be willing to co-invest if you want to have co-marketing rights. That's usually something pharma doesn't want. But I think today they're more willing to consider those kinds of scenarios depending on the strength and resources the small company might have. But I think the sort of the worst fall into that category where they're either pitching a product without the benefit of knowing what the buyer might be. We may not even be in a space and people are telling us about a therapeutic that wouldn't be a fit, or sort of this convoluted way to say how valuable and how many millions a particular opportunity might be worth that isn't really based on reality.
So Mark, from your first company to your sixth company, in that delta, what did you learn? What did you learn in your first pitch to an investor versus the 6? How did you sort of get more sophisticated and smooth out the bumps? What was your biggest lesson learned?
Well, I'm going to echo and maybe give a couple of examples of what Cameron and Ron were describing, how the pressure is on you to understand your audience and to understand how your audience's mentality and emotions may have changed while you're on a roadshow. And you have to be willing to respond and walk into the next meeting completely ready to address that in a way that doesn't look like it's out of sequence, but in fact always was part of your story, right? The first thing I'd say is, as over many iterations, is you cannot be boring, right? You cannot. It sounds stupid or obvious, but you can't. You know, there's this great novel, again with the literature, by Italo Calvino called If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler. That's the title. And you're like, what? What happened to the traveler? You have to be able to create some sort of tension and suspense so that people really want to hear the story. And you have to be ready to satisfy those audience. So Targanta, 2006, on the road, ultimately raised a $70 million Series C from OrbiMed, Bain, and Skyline in San Francisco. As we were on the road, in early October, the FDA blew up, you remember this, an infectious disease, Replidyne, and said there will never again be anything but a sort of placebo-controlled trials for sort of non-serious infectious disease. On the West Coast, I had people trying to cancel meetings. And I said, you have to give us 5 minutes. And literally, they'd be sitting there, I just lost X million dollars on Replidyne. You got 3 minutes to tell me why I shouldn't kick you out. Nothing personal. I just can't stand antibiotics right now. They stink. And you better be ready with a story. You know, and this guy could quote a chapter and verse. First of all, it's not serious
So
diseases,
tell us your story.
Yeah.
We're 3 minutes.
Oh, well, Mr. OrbiMed, first of all, that decision by the FDA very specifically involved only non-serious things such as sinusitis, does not involve serious infections. We will have the first indication, complicated skin and skin structure infections, and we'll move on from there towards pneumonia and all the others. And we are specifically differentiated to provide a benefit because of the unique activity against MRSA and the fact that this drug can be given in a single dose, and actually that with a half-life of 360 hours, that's all the dose you need. So that drug is actually approved now and saving lives, Aridavance and Orbactive. We went public 3 months after or 6 months after the Series C closed. So that's one example. Current, flash forward to the present. I came on board IRX, exciting data, 5-year survival data in head and neck cancer, 80% survival in people where tumor activation occurs versus 30 or 40% prediction of overall survival in 5 years in this population. So very exciting data. The problem is immuno-oncology is white hot, and the current deck that I picked up when I walked in the door, 70 slides long. First of all, that's like just shoot us, right? It's got to be 25 or 30 slides at the very most, maybe 20. Went for the entire 70 slides and never once talked about competitive differentiation or the competitive landscape. There are 20 PD-1s right now, right? 20 PD-1s in development, not just CTLA-4, OX40. There's 20 of them. To walk in and not be ready to talk about competitive differentiation is to be kicked out after 5 minutes. So it's understanding who your audience is, what their hot buttons are, and then having a story that has been rehearsed and crafted and crystallized and diamond hard so that you can actually say it with confidence and you can react immediately and with confidence to the specific neuroses of your potential investors.
So take us through the arc of that story, of those 20 slides. So first we're going to talk about the problem, the unmet need. That's the natural place that we want to start. What point are we going to start to get into the science and the technical aspects? Just take us through the arc of the story.
Well, I actually always have the executive summary. It maybe comes from my Bain days, but if there are so many people that will run roughshod over your agenda, and they will jump to, I don't care about that. I want to talk about that, and automatically you're on slide 15. Otherwise, you're in a fight with the person, and that's not going to end well because they're the audience, right? If you can force them to spend 2 minutes on the executive summary, you get through IP, mechanism of action, competitive differentiation, pipeline, exit, all the things that are going to be important, and most of the time you can quell the revolt and say, okay, if you just let me go through this, I'll get to that in like 3 minutes. But at least you've gotten through it so that they're not sitting there with that misconception in your head that, that in their head. So I would say too, the arc of the storyline is executive summary. What is the key unmet need we're trying to solve? In our case, we have a slide with all 5 IO drugs approved saying, here's what they're approved in. Typically, they only work in 20-25% of patients, and the new combos are not additive. They are barely incremental. So the missing piece of the puzzle is lymphocyte infiltration to tumor activation. And oh, by the way, that's what we're selling. We have a host of cytokines that upregulate all the immuno-oncology markers as well as the checkpoint markers. Interested to hear more? Yes. So then we go through the biology, the mechanism. Then because it's a hot button, because it's biologic, we actually spend 4 or 5 slides talking about CMC and supply chain before we get to the clinical evidence. Clinical evidence is like the shoving the knife in. That is usually the clincher in the conversations we've had. And then you talk about IP, if they're still interested, usually they are, and then next steps, key next steps, and use of proceeds.
Now, in this era of very much a focus on outcomes and the payers, how much pressure is there to anticipate not only the regulatory path and how long that's going to take and how much it's going to cost, because all investors need to know that, and you have to have thought that through. But what's the pressure to have sort of anticipated the payer environment, what you, in realistic terms, what you think the reimbursement potential is, right?
I did an IPO that was successful, 10 times oversubscribed and traded up in the summer of 15 for Chiasma, a rare disease company. And we were 9 months, we had just filed the NDA actually. So they were obsessed with market access. We had to have the story of chapter and verse about all the pharmacoeconomic arguments we had, all the competitive offerings, how we were going to fit in. We'd already done the work with some of the major PBMs. So we're able to talk specifics with them. So doing that homework was really important. And the landscape is falling away. There's sort of a increasing willingness to fund only life-threatening indications. Right? And I'm seeing that right now. So I tore a significant muscle a few weeks ago, and my insurance company is declining the MRI at this point. So I'm just rehabbing on my own.
We learn how to do that. Yeah.
If the physician, and it generally was the physician rather than the broader healthcare professional group, in the 80s and 90s was the key customer, and if it became more about the patient in the 90s and 2000s, I believe it's now the payer that is the key constituent. To some of the questions you're asking around pitching, and to maybe build off what Mark said, which I completely agree with, the pitch is a bit of theater too. So you better be on your A game every single time. And it doesn't matter that this is city number 5 out of 5 in the last 5 days. And if you've had 8 meetings a day, lucky you, but this had better be like the first one in terms of freshness. You better know your numbers. You have to know your numbers. How long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? Who's the competition? What do they charge? Make sure that the font is consistent on your slides. Make sure you don't have funny looking graphics and text. It matters. It may seem like it shouldn't, but trust me, it does. Spend a lot of time rehearsing. Rehearse in front of the mirror to yourself, in front of the dog, in front of anyone you can reel in. Get sessions on tough questions. And challenge yourself. What are the questions I really hope they don't ask me? And have some form of answer. Even if the answer is, we don't know right now, but we'll find out. Never, ever wing it on an answer. You'll get found out.
Now, Ron, we're talking about companies that are maybe, raising Series C funds, are on a roadshow. But you're talking with a lot of startup people, right? Kind of out of the lab, much earlier stage technologies. This doesn't pertain to them, does it? Can they be as raw as they need to be and just sit down with Ron and have a nice technical discussion? What are your expectations?
In a lot of cases, that's correct, right? I mean, there are payer considerations, and when we think about, we pharma, talk about best in class and first in class, that's actually a reflection of the fact that the payer is not willing to pay for anything that isn't the best possible or the least expensive. So that is a primary focus, even for fresh startups. If you're gonna bring out a statin today, right? That's kind of the worst case scenario of something of not recognizing where the market is and what you're investing your resources against. So yes, we would not have detailed marketing discussions, but at that basic level, you have to be addressing an unmet need. It can be a technology toward a need, but yes, they are much different types of conversations. You are thinking about the enabling science. Yes, we're not, we're investing a few $1 million alongside other investors. We Pfizer, the way we've structured our seed fund, we typically don't take rights when we make seed investments, but we want an observer seat on the board. We want to provide technical guidance. We want to provide access to experts within our company or within the investor group, that there's a willingness. And I think one of the things that I've learned over my time, both within pharma and as a biotech person, the makeup of the board and those that are invested in the company are unbelievably important. It's not just that, yes, they have a recognized name and they're putting a lot of money into your company, but they have a very significant influence on your daily life and how the company is going to progress and what that culture is going to be like. I think, good boards give you time and understand science is difficult, things take time, there's going to be challenges along the way, and hopefully they'll have sufficient patience. A lot of times we react to the business plan that's presented to us by a startup company, and they have a budget outline that they want to meet certain milestones over a certain period of time, and it's really, we're reacting to that. And I think most investors go about that. Now, there might be some adjustment to that over time, but we're really responding to what it is you think is necessary. And so there's a lot of analysis and understanding that has to go into that. And if you get people that buy in, and maybe we all kind of contribute and revise that plan a bit and what the funding is and what milestones are going to be important, it really is getting to the next inflection point, next point of value where you could raise more money because things are de-risked slightly, and you have a better sense of where you're headed. And most companies change directions over the course of a fairly short period of time. They find something better, they find what they started with doesn't work, but then if you're smart, you'll take market input and recognize that, well, we thought this was good, but somebody else pointed out to us there's a better opportunity here. And there's plenty of examples. I think Regeneron, Amgen, there's plenty of big successful companies today that have gone through that transition over time.
So Ron, let's be honest here. If I come and sit down with you and I haven't done my market research and my numbers aren't really tight, right? I haven't sharpened the pencil on them, and I don't really seem to know the value of what I have, aren't you going to take advantage of me in a negotiation if you're really interested in that asset?
So what's the right answer to that
He does
question,
have to
right?
think about it.
The right answer is
So
no.
first of all, no, right?
Right answer.
But we won't take you seriously either, right? I think you won't have the credibility that you want. I mean, I hope that I've only been at Merck and Pfizer internally, right? So I know how they really work and what their cultures are like. And I think we don't want to take advantage of anyone. I think we do have to look at, you have to have strong IP. You have to have a competitive position. You have to be strong and to understand who the competition is and why you should be the best or among the best. I think if you come in and you have a weak understanding of your opportunity or your needs, what I generally do is I try to provide helpful input. I will always be polite. We will often have a franker discussion internally that this group doesn't know what they're doing, they don't have the right expertise. We'll try to point out, hey, you should go find experts that have expertise that you might be missing. But I really want to provide input that helps you, even if you're not ready today for an investment or a collaboration or a partnership, so that you can do that. And I think having a lot of those meetings with a lot of companies, most companies need one partner, right? So every opportunity should be a learning experience until you find that right one, or you've honed your story and you've taken all that input. I think those are the best sort of leaders of companies.
Mm-hmm. So I think the common wisdom is that when you start your company and prepare your business plan, you really have to have your exit scenario in mind. So Mark, how true or untrue is that? And how do you think about, when we might not have enough information to anticipate that, but how do you think about your exit and how do you describe that to investors?
I will.
You can't tell everybody you want to do an IPO.
I'll cover that. I want to say two things
Okay.
in response to these guys, just because it's important to say, guys, unless you have to be very aware that the reward for your success in convincing one of these guys may be that they like the idea and you lose your job. If they really like it, it is not uncommon at all. It's happened to several colleagues that someone says, love the company, go to invest on the condition that you actually aren't CEO, or you're not COO, or you're not CSO. You're just not ready. I see you as kind of a, and you're like, well, the hell with that. But events have moved on, and maybe the folks around you with the team are like, come on, we got to do this. So just be aware of that. Unless you have something up here or some sort of fail-safe tripwire, the reward for your success may be that someone else gets to pursue it. So be conscious of that. The second thing on boards is that a board is kind of like a focus group until they have to make a vote, right? Then they're a jury. They really are. And you've seen the movie 12 Angry Men. Think of like 7 angry men and women, or 8, confused and angry individuals. Wealthy, very wealthy, or used to getting their own way. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been asked to be on the board. And so think about it as a hung jury that can convict innocent people, or let guilty people go free, like that idiot that you've been working with that you really know is responsible for the screw-ups of the company. You really have to think of the board as a decision-making jury with irrevocable decision-making power, because once they do it, it's done. So exit strategy, sorry.
Well, let's come back a moment. So you choose your board, or at least you'll have a hand in choosing the board.
You never choose your board.
Well, as the CEO.
If you're founding the company.
Yeah,
you get a
as the
chance.
founder, you're
Yeah.
potentially going to choose the board. So talk a few minutes about how you're
get
going to do that. Yeah.
Well, as incoming CEO in my situations, I work towards an evolutionary approach for the board, which is, okay, we're pointing towards the future. We need more of this ilk, more operating, more commercial, less VC. I founded 2 companies, and in that case, I was a member of the board, and there was a small board. There were 3 or 4 people. And for a small company, you don't need more than a few, right? When you get it to a bigger raise, you may want to bring on more people that have more sort of throw weight in terms of connections and ability to tell the story. But the dynamic should be that there is a level of trust. If you're starting out with someone who you don't trust, just prepare yourself for all the fights, right? There's going to be someone who you're not willing to share information with, who might not be willing to share information with you. And if they're there for whatever reason, because they had the money, or it was their idea, or they have some sort of ties to the technology, it's just adding more level of difficulty to your process.
Okay, Cameron, did you want to comment on the board? I don't know if you had any activist board members on KaloBios, how you've handled board members who were particularly. Yeah.
We wound up with no board members, actually, so that was easy. But we have a board now, and I didn't appoint any of them. And that was purposeful from the investor's point of view, because they thought that if I brought people who I think could contribute to a board, that they would be in my pocket. And they didn't want that dynamic, so they wanted people who were in their pocket. So boards, particularly public company boards, actually, let me step back. So you want to be a CEO. You want to found your own company because it'll all be happiness and light, and you'll be your own boss, and it'll be just wonderful. It won't. It is the hardest you'll ever work, and someone's in charge, and it's not you. The money is in charge. That's a really important lesson. You should not forget that, which means you should absolutely, if you can't be on the same page, understand the perspective of the money, because the money is in control, not you. Boards get involved in assisting with strategy and ensuring that the company is operating to strategy. In a public company environment, there are governance requirements that boards have to adhere to. And the other thing they do is they hire and fire the CEO. And there's plenty else we could talk about. There's 5-day workshops on boards and what have you, but those are kind of the things that you need to remember.
Okay, let's go back to exit now, Mark. So talk a little bit about the strategy around thinking about the exit scenario.
Yeah, so lack of an exit is almost always a deal killer. Lack of a defined exit. It might not be the ultimate one you decide on, but if you don't come in with an idea about when the investors you're presenting to are going to actually be able to get liquidity, then your storyline has this big, what happens at the end? You know, does the maiden get rescued or not? Does the ship sail? What? Yeah, well, I'm not here for the science. I'm here for the exit, right? I mean, there is, everyone has charitable and eleemosynary instincts, and that's great. And some people have an undying wish, like Ned Johnson, who put $100 million plus into in vivo before it came Forum, and the German billionaire who funded Therion, who put $100 million of his own money into this one company. But most investors want to understand the exit, what the multiple is going to be, what the timing is, and most important, are you raising enough money to get to an inflection point where I have the chance of data and another fundraising or an exit with money to spare. You can't say, I'm getting there, we're going to finish the trial of phase 1B in February, and we have money to last until February 28th. My analogy of that is you're a runaway, you're on a bus, and you arrive at Penn Station at 3 in the morning. The people who are willing to help you are not your friends. None of them are your friends. So you have to have a clear storyline as to why and how you're going to get an inflection point with enough time to turn the company around, recast, either raise more money or sell.
Now, Ron, you probably see technologies, you probably see platform technologies, you might see on the therapeutic side, multiple indications in terms of the strategic plan. So we're going to start out with wet AMD, and then we're going to have a sepsis program, and then we're going to go over, to another therapeutic area because our technology is that wonderful. How do you think about that? Is that necessary to lay out all the potential indications, or do you prefer that a company really double down and show that they understand an indication, a market, a type of provider and patient? What do you recommend?
Yeah, so I come at that more from the biotech side, just having experienced that and thinking about how you pitch to potential partners or licensors of your technology. Most of the people you're going to be talking to, and it's broader than healthcare, should be smart consumers of what it is you're talking to them about. I actually prefer to leave to them the exploration of additional opportunities. I think it's important to focus and think about, to do everything costs a lot of money and shows a lack of focus and probably insufficient resources to hire enough people to do everything. So I think it's better to think about unmet need, commercial and competitive opportunity, and focus on one or two things, but show a broad patent portfolio or a know-how capability that would enable other areas, and let your potential partner think about that, because they will always do that. They'll either have a related program or problem internally that they can't solve and might see in your technology a solution. They may ask about that, and I think it's good to enable that and have answers ready if you've thought about that. But I think, and investors almost always say you've got to focus. You can't do everything. We don't want to invest in all of those interesting, though unproven ideas. You got to really narrow it down, have a tight sort of pitch about what you're about, what you're trying to help solve, and the ideal partner, and let them brainstorm a bit. I think that works well.
I think you magnify your credibility for a broader portfolio of possibilities if you get one thing across either the finish line or a significant value inflection point. And then suddenly, magically, the other stuff looks like that may have value. But if it's all unproven, having 20 so-called shots on goal is not going to be helpful.
Okay, so let's talk about sort of strategic investment mix, if you had your druthers. So potentially you have a technology that you've founded here at Columbia, and you've gotten some NIH grants, and now you're going to start on that path of raising capital. What's the sequence of capital? If you had your choice, what kind of money do you want in what sort of phasing?
you want me to start, or?
Sure.
Okay, so if you have your druthers right now, you don't want to stay away from venture, right? Because venture is going to exact a certain price in terms of control and valuation, and they will micromanage because that's what they like to do. But we don't live in the real world, not the perfect world. You know, I have a friend, Walter Ogier, who started a company in Tufts New England Medical Center called Acetylon, and they raised $50 million from private investors. Ken Anderson, who was treated one of these billionaires' family's wife, Myra Kraft family, Patriots, passed away. That was half the money, and then the other half came from the pitch. Now, Walter is a longtime biotech veteran, so he had all of the toolkit. And because of that, and because of this core investment, he was able to avoid the sort of draconian terms of venture. The company I work at, IRX, has not had a significant venture investment. In fact, it's more than 100 different individual investors. This is a company based in the Brooklyn Army Terminal who the founder is a Sloan Kettering physician who conceived of this story back in the 90s. So it has not had venture or private equity, but we are going towards an institutional funding round now. In a perfect world, if you could have non-venture capital, that's where I'd go first, because now the amount of wealth created with high net worth individuals allows you to have sort of game-changing capital investments from people who will not exact those very tough terms. But most people end up going to venture.
So I think the latest statistic I read said that about 80% of biotechs in the US only have 2 to 3 months of money left. So Cameron, talk to us about financial discipline.
Yeah.
You took over a company that was bankrupt. So
Yes.
you must know a little something about financial discipline. What's your approach to making the cash last?
I think you really have to know where every penny is going and what you're investing in is going to deliver more than a penny. A lot of biotech companies and maybe pre-biotech startups are constantly in fundraising mode. And it isn't such a bad mindset to keep thinking about where you're going to grow value and deliver return for investors. So our financial discipline is having a very tough P&L, knowing where things are going, looking at where the next tranche of investment is going to come from. We're in that phase right now. 2 to 3 months seems pretty luxurious to me, actually. So, and some companies are just really scrambling. In terms of sources, so the point that was being discussed, and I might do what I think we were briefed to do, which is respectfully try and disagree a little, just for a bit of theater, if nothing else. I don't think venture's all bad because it's what comes attached to the money. There are some venture groups and individuals that can add a lot of value to the company in terms of helping you source other deals, bringing in other financing partners that they syndicate with, bringing in talent. You may need additional senior leadership on staff. They may be able to offer that. They can also offer strategic insights. So it isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you have to choose very carefully and do a lot of diligence, particularly around when things got bad, how did they behave? And you'll usually hear of all of the glittering successes that were a 20x return in 4 weeks. That's fantastic. But what about all of the portfolio companies that didn't work out? How much of it was a mix of the advice from the venture groups that were involved versus the management team? So it isn't all bad and it isn't all good.
One question for Mark. Don't angels tend to exaggerate valuation?
I think it depends on, I think anybody who's going to do this is going to try and get comps, right? They should and you should, because you don't want to overinflate your valuation because then you have a much bigger mountain to climb if you get an exit, right? They're saying if you get a pre-money of $50 million for a startup and you sell it for 60 and you've been there for 4 years, you could have done better, in bonds, right? So On the other hand, if your pre-money is down to 10. So I think, I totally agree with what Cameron said. If you guys, if this startup team is relatively light on management and they don't go to the jugular and say, no, you're not even part of management anymore, really the next best thing is to have very knowledgeable folks with pattern recognition and the VC that are saying, no, that way 9 times out of 10 leads to disaster. Let's do this instead, and to help the company. But I think for folks who've been through this a few iterations, that pattern recognition is less needed, and the amount of intrusiveness is less desired.
So do we have anyone from Columbia Tech Ventures here this afternoon? Oh, okay, great. So Ron, maybe since we're talking about, the funding and we'll kind of switch over to IP, what is your advice in terms of licensing a technology from the university and sort of navigating that process? And you have some experience doing that. A lot of people have good stories to share and not so good stories to share. So what do you need to know in order to embark on that negotiation?
Yeah, it is complicated. It's very dependent on the institution, on sort of the culture, how engaged or unengaged the office might be, or how renegade the faculty might be. Right? You see a whole diversity of that depending where in the world you might be working and what the institutional sort of culture is. I think as whether investors or collaborative partners, acquirers of technology, we want to know that the target company has ownership rights to their know-how, to their IP. And typically that does mean that they've licensed something, some core discovery, some technology out of a faculty member's lab. Maybe the faculty himself has moved into the company. Typically not the case, but we want to know that there's sort of a chain of ownership and that there's typically rights that flow back to the university that we would be picking up or helping compensate the company for. Patent costs, all of those kinds of things are things you have to think about. A lot of times universities have innovation funds or funds available to help make that happen. Some will give below market or very beneficial terms around IP in the early stages and expect to be repaid if there's a partnership down the road, and that's usually pretty reasonable. We expect to see that, and I think it shows respectable ownership of what the underlying IP is. Typically, you'll license out into your company from a university the core IP, the core knowledge. It's limited, it has lots of potential, and universities aren't generally too onerous in sort of helping you make that happen. And then your mission is to add value, is to create more IP and more value around that, but that should be part of the core or enabling infrastructure. And so I think those are things to think about. And many companies then find in doing their competitive analysis, and you see this fought in the literature and in the scientific literature as well as the popular press, that you need other IP from other universities, other companies, cross-licensing. You need to share IP in some way. And all of that's really pretty traditional business development. And a lot of people don't want to broach that sometimes. I think it's important that you face that and think about what else would make us a stronger company? What other IP might we bring in? Who might we collaborate or maybe even merge our company with to make us a stronger investment prospect?
Cameron, you have a comment?
Yeah, so I think particularly with institutions such as this, the core value building block is 2 things. It's IP and it's compelling data. What you build on top of that in time is adequate financing, perhaps partnerships with recognized players, the management team. All of those things add more value. And there are a number of investors that I know that say that they would rather invest in a superb, stellar management team with an average technology than an average management team with a stellar technology. Part of your job, if you choose to accept this mission, is to be stellar at something valuable. And if you're not, learn. And if you're not willing to do that, you're not serious about this.
Okay, we'll come back to that point. Mark, can you comment on IP strategy, potentially for the company that you're now with, how you think about it. It can often be the largest portion of your budget. So how do you think pragmatically, but also in a way that protects you adequately?
Sure. So I think let me give an example of a company and the company who I turned down just before I took this job, because IP was one of the key fulcrum points, the lack of a coherent IP strategy in the previous company. So this company has, it's a host of cytokines that are expressed from monocytes. There's 7 different cytokines that are all part of the release specs. The cytokines themselves, or this process, has been reviewed by FDA, EMEA, the very exacting people at the Paul Ehrlich Institute in Germany, and they've signed off on later stage clinical trials. So we're all comfortable with that. The process itself is the product. We don't have cDNAs for the 7 cytokines. So the process is actually there. And so when I was doing my diligence, the patent attorneys, Wolf Greenfield, said, this is really, first of all, we have data this year that suggests we could file new filings and have 20 more years worth of exclusivity. So that's incredibly important. I've been in companies that had 6 years of exclusivity and a critical deal didn't get done, only to have a month later, Congress passed the GAIN Act, which provided an additional 5 years of exclusivity in this particular indication. The deal would have gotten done if we'd had 11. With the discounted cash flow at 6, didn't get done. It didn't trip the hammer. So long IP protection without having to cross-license to lose a lot of significant asset is so important to the value proposition. This company that I turned down was a cystic fibrosis opportunity with a potential really to do something powerful in airway obstruction. It had multiple mechanisms of action. I still fervently hope they bring the product to market because it's such an unmet need. But because they were resource constrained, they had not filed in any of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And the process is essentially incredibly obvious and there was really no way that this product was ever going to be taken up in any major way without being completely destroyed by generics. It's very cheap to make, it's very powerful. I wish them the best, but there was no way to build a company on this IP structure because it was going to be obvious and it was going to be reproduced with a few tries. And that's the shame of it. The shame of it is that IP can actually thwart an entire process here that could lead to a commercial product and lives being saved.
Cameron, anything to add?
Maybe you should start that generic company, Mark.
Yeah, I think I signed a CDA with these guys. I'm not sure I can do that.
Okay. We could talk a little bit also about pre-launch planning and launch planning. So, what goes into the efforts around preparing the launch of your drug, because I think both of you have had that experience of actually bringing a drug to market with Biogen and also with Cameron. So maybe just walk us through what are some of the highlights and things to think about and the pitfalls in terms of the pre-launch process.
Okay, I'll go first. It's changing, and one of the joys of this industry is you have to constantly be on your game and constantly be open to learning new things. So that said, understanding who the constituents are, and I've already stated, I think the payer is becoming a very, very important constituent, if not the primary constituent. Understanding what kinds of health economic and outcomes arguments you'll need to marshal to support the brand is very, very important. And having those conversations as early as is reasonable. So post-phase 2, perhaps as late as while you're in pivotal phase 3s, to suddenly say, surprise, with, for example, Sovaldi, the payers, was not a happy experience for a lot of payers. So spending also a lot of time with key opinion leaders advocacy groups, depending on the therapeutic area that you're playing in, and marshalling as much scientific evidence as you can to support the product. That means a lot of publications, congresses, symposia, reputable peer-reviewed journals, reputable people on your scientific advisory board that are well recognized. It is sometimes said that you really can't start some of these activities soon enough, and they tend to be pretty costly. There's a whole new area around digital and social and mobile. So those are things that people are grappling with in terms of a whole range of governance, privacy, and security issues. So a lot of complex constituents and moving parts, and that amplifies if you're looking at a number of countries. Launch sequencing is important, integrity of product supply is important. What it isn't is what I've sometimes heard, particularly, I guess, from people that have more of a scientific founder background, is, well, look, we'll get the product approved, and we'll just hire some reps, give them some brochures, and the product will sell itself. How hard can it be? What could possibly go wrong? Commercializing is really, really hard, and it's getting harder. Maybe as just we're talking about hard stuff, two kind of maybe pithy comments. The hardest thing you will ever do if you're going along this adventure is raising money. The most important thing you have to do is amass great, if possible, world-class talent.
So launch, so as I said, I've got 6 years of commercial experience and then multiple years of pre-launch experience. Some of these drugs didn't get approved, but I still built a full commercial team and got ready. I think Cameron's absolutely right. Life has changed a lot. I think the core issues are, for me, that the central theme is always how are you presenting yourself to the commercial audience, payers, the 7 or 8 different constituencies, all that matter, payers, patients, physicians, clinics, societies for these ill patients. You have to, my rule of thumb is you have to either win them over or you have to make them neutral. Not neutralize them, not make them a non-factor. Just make them not throw their bodies in front of the door and say these people can't get this product on the market. And so everything that you do there is not just sitting there and talking to them, it's things like pricing, right? Where is your going to price? And pricing is the third rail in pharma right now. And you know, it may not be fashionable, but I think that there is a lot of immoral pricing in biotech. And I'm not just talking about the companies that buy a generic and raise it 5,000%. I'm talking about my former company, Biogen. When we launched Avonex, it was $11,000 a year. It's $65,000 now. They've been taking 10% price increases for 20 years. Did the product suddenly require more? No, it required more competitive investment. And yes, it's funding research, but really, you know, so, and then there's the whole cadre of big biopharma, Amgen, Genentech, who have consistently fought against biosimilars. I will tell you that Biogen's Avonex was the first biosimilar. We changed the cell line after phase 3. We changed it and we got buy-off from Catherine Zune at Sieber because she was an interferon postdoc. $35 billion worth later. Don't tell me that biosimilars don't work. They do. But there is a lobby of the biggest and most powerful companies, and obviously I'm never going to get a job working at one of those places again, that doesn't want you to believe that. And it's just not true. So coming back to the tactics, though, how do you launch? You got pricing, and our strategy in almost every case, whether I launched with a product or not, was not to be the nail that sticks up and gets hammered down. It's to come in between 0 and 10% beneath the market leader. And if you're successful, you can always take price increases, not 10% a year, later, and make it up. But you never, ever have a chance to relaunch the product. You never have a chance to do that. If you lose momentum in the first 6 or 9 months, it's game over. And so pricing, I've gone on long enough. over the beers, there could be a lot more stories, but, it gets into, I mean, almost in street fighting at some point, We were launching in Europe, and we were getting our butts kicked by Serono, and they were paying doctors $25,000 a patient to switch patients. This is Ernesto Bertorelli running the company. Later, they paid $750 million fine in the United States without admitting guilt. Think what, and we came up with a slogan, which I won't go into, it's boring, but we debuted this slogan in Nice at the European Neurology meeting. And I'm talking to a doctor, and one of our people runs up and says, "You have to come quick." And I said, just let me finish. He goes, "No, Serono's attacking our booth." So I walk down there, and there are these two people screaming and yelling because they feel the slogan is incorrect. Well, the regulators had signed off on it. I literally had to walk these two people out of the like this, walk them out of the booth. So it can get quite emotional.
So Ron, I think you're sitting as the big Pfizer guy in the middle of these two individuals. So would you like it to just take a moment and encounter? I know that, drug pricing, Ian Reed, the CEO of Pfizer, has been, very well spoken about wanting to sort of tackle these pricing problems. I mean, I think some of the smaller companies, what I've observed is that they're trying to run or design and run leaner protocols so that they can pass the savings on to the patients, which is very noble. Sometimes the investigators don't believe that. So even though they try to put that in their mission statement and use that to encourage the investigative site, somehow they don't believe it. So we're already, we're obviously very far down the path in terms of people's skepticism and perceptions about, pharma and pricing. But how would you like to counter the comments?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily counter too much of what's been said. I agree. Certainly as a consumer, as someone who has, we all have family members who need something that is unbelievably expensive. It is, I understand the economic arguments, and it's certainly the case. Thinking about Mark's scenario about a potential therapeutic that could address a medical need, but there's no way to run clinical studies with no money. So you can't just bring a generic out without the clinical studies to show that it's safe. So there's really no solution there. I think pharma has to be sensitive to this. I mean, it's a very political environment. And I think this is, this got front page billing through the presidential election all fall. I think we have to be sensitive to that. We have to be responsible. We are trying to, at the same time, run a business, and sort of that's how the analysis comes into play, that you as small companies have to think about that as well. Can you produce and manufacture and sell something at a price that relieves a burden on the medical system, if not on individual buyers, if you have to pay out of pocket for something, which is a challenge. If anything is over, $5,000 even per year is tough for most consumers. So it's complicated, and I think that's why we look at these metrics and these ideas so early on in the process, because you don't want to waste investor or scientist time and money on something that won't be commercially viable. So, and then to the launch scenario, I've not had that late stage commercial experience myself, but I will tell you that, of course, our pitch, there's so much innovation happening in small companies today. I think the environment is so different today than it was even 20 years ago around who can do drug discovery, who can do innovation, who can bring things to sort of the phase 2 or so stage of development. And pharma then will pitch that we should be the group to launch for you, right? That's our sales pitch. We have all that infrastructure, that know-how. It is hard to build, and I've not had the experience, but I wouldn't try that myself, right? If I were in a small company to try to build that, I'd rather go to a pharma or a big biotech to be my partner who has that expertise, has the market presence, has the distribution channels, and sort of be their partner to get that there.
That makes sense.
Just to make a comment on pricing, it's something that I have a personal passion for, and if any of you have followed the KaloBios story with initially Shkreli, we issued on April the 11th last year what we call a responsible pricing model. And the model rests on 3 core foundations. One is transparency. We believe that you have to be utterly transparent. It can't be, well, it's all the PBM's fault. Look over there, don't look at us. We have to be utterly transparent. It's also about affordability, and we intend to make public what goes into the cost of our products, including cost of goods, what we've spent on clinical development, regulatory, distribution, marketing. And the third piece is a reasonable return. So if this costs 50 cents to make, should you sell it for $50? Of course not. But you can't sell it for 49 cents and stay in business. And reasonableness of return will not be set by me and my colleagues. It'll be set by our customers. So it'll be healthcare professionals, advocacy groups, patients, policymakers, payers, and NGOs who are very involved in some of the spaces that we're in. When we launched that just over a year ago, there was a lot of hoo-ha. It created a right old kerfuffle because people thought that we were somewhat insane, and that may be true. But if you fast forward a year, you see a number of companies now taking their own version of the responsible pricing model. In fact, a couple of companies have cut and pasted some of what we put in our model and claimed it as part of theirs going forward. It doesn't really take many years of a 10% price increase and you've doubled the price. That is not responsible. Egregious pricing is just not acceptable. In this country, medical expenses are the #1 reason for personal bankruptcy. And the Federal Reserve published a survey. It's based on 2015 data, but nonetheless, I think the findings are quite telling that 47% of American households could not withstand a $400 unexpected expense without either borrowing money or selling something. And so pricing is here to stay, and it needs to be tackled. And some of the industry organization rhetoric just is flim-flam, in my opinion. Kind of makes me either very popular or unpopular as a panel member when I share the podium with some of those folks. But nonetheless, we believe that this is changing. It's changing all around us. We're all consumers, and we need to pay very, very strong attention to this.
So just shifting gears before we open it up to the audience. So we're here at the Precision Medicine Initiative Seminar Series and want to talk a little bit about the combination of diagnostics with orphan and rare diseases and biomarkers, and where that science is taking us and how those sorts of studies are designed and how investors are thinking about that. So why don't you each just comment on where you think that fits, how your company thinks about it. Certainly it makes it more custom type of treatment for patients. Those drugs can be very expensive, and doing the biomarkers can or cannot pan out. So.
Yeah, I think it's the key to the kingdom. It solves, it doesn't solve, but it alleviates this pricing, this vexing pricing. Because if you're really just treating the patients who really can benefit, if you do have a diagnostic that is that precise, then from a quality perspective or you can justify the price, even if it is a six-figure price. If you're saving a 10-year-old's life who's going to be healthy and live for the rest of their life, everyone can agree. Hopefully, I don't have a problem with the Hep C drugs. They're curative. They're curative, and the cost to the healthcare system was going to be millions for these people individually. But there's been enough outraged abuses that now any high price provokes the system, provokes the response. But in our case, oncology. My mom had breast cancer. She had melanoma. She beat that. She had breast cancer, and she was Herceptin, responsive to Herceptin, and that bought her another 4 years of life, which we all treasure, right? So we have biomarker evidence that we are working on now that could be predictive of the efficacy of our drug. We're still in phase 2, so we're a long way to go. But everyone, I think, would agree that if you can actually zero in on diagnostics that hopefully start to guarantee or predict the efficacy of the drug, then a lot of these arguments, a lot of this heat and light starts to be dissipated because people are treating the right people at the right time with the right drug.
Anybody else want to comment?
Yeah, I'd add to that. I think it picks up a number of points that we've talked about through the course of this panel. I think we, Pfizer certainly, are looking at how to address orphan diseases, rare diseases, getting into gene therapy, getting into areas that are really, even 5 years ago, were very challenging to even consider commercially, right? You think of a gene therapy, curative, what's the value of that, and how do you price that, and how can you afford to develop that? It is addressable if you know you have a very defined patient population, if you have a diagnostic that you can use to identify those patients based on their having or lack of having a gene, for example, and you can track them through clinical studies and then use that as a monitoring diagnostic. Once it's launched in the market, you can ensure that those that enter into clinical studies are going to benefit or not. You don't have non-responders. It brings down the cost of development quite considerably. It was a learning for me, and it's been a number of years, but I think when I finally realized that sort of the economics are about, and it applies really only for those that are part of an insurance system, but if you can bring a therapeutic forward that is cheaper to cure or to address the need than the burden on the system, then the system should be willing to pay that. And having the evidence to support that was really something I had never appreciated before. How can anyone afford a $400,000 therapeutic, for example, is just mind-boggling to me. But when you think that that might have been paid, even with discounts and so on, through the insurance system, and if you can reduce that burden, then that's really the argument that companies are looking to make, and they have to be able to develop a drug that can meet all of those various commercial considerations.
So my experience has been that a lot of payers don't mind paying higher prices if it works with an acceptable tolerability and adverse event profile. It's just, in a lot of cases, you don't know if it is going to work for that particular patient. So having some kind of biomarker or other evidence that allows you greater precision and predictability is a good thing from a payer and an outcome point of view. So who wouldn't take equivalent or better outcomes for lower cost? That's nirvana. And it isn't quite as simple as that, as we know. So, and just by the way, in terms of outcomes, the US ranks about number 17 in developed countries. So we don't do that well in terms of outcomes compared to a peer group. It also kind of pivots into, well, pharmaceuticals and biologics are just part of the delivery of healthcare, which is hugely inefficient in this and many other countries. So there are other things to nibble on. And the disparities even within this country. So I'll just give you one that I read recently. This is when we play audience participation time. So who can guess the average number of days it takes for someone in Massachusetts to see their family physician for a routine physical? Anyone? 80? Close? Any more? 109 days. Average number of days in Atlanta, by the same metric, 27 days. Why? People just not have much else to do in Atlanta that, you know, they can get to see their doc. Well, what's going on? We all know that there are these inefficiencies in the provision of healthcare, which goes well beyond pharmaceuticals. The gene therapy example is interesting. GSK launched a gene therapy product, Strimvelis, and they just announced that their first patient was on it. It's pretty extraordinary that people have been seriously talking about mortgage-type financial instruments to pay for the cost. I think there's something societally very wrong with that. And the fact that we kind of just shrug our shoulders now with Biogen just getting approval for Binura for Batten disease, $700,000 a treatment course. Doesn't seem so bad when you're talking about over $1 million a treatment course. We might need to press the reset button.
Okay, thank you for that intriguing commentary on that. I think we have some questions, so over here.
The current generation of, or the next generation of lipid-lowering drugs, the PCSK9 inhibitors, list priced $14,000 a year. There was positive data presented at the ACC 6 weeks ago, but the current indications are for a very narrow group of patients. Amgen recently announced that they're willing to give a money-back guarantee for anyone who has a heart attack or a stroke taking these medicines. I don't know the metric, but just wanted to hear your comments because obviously the medicines are not selling well due to mainly the PBMs. I've heard 80% of the prescriptions are being rejected, and obviously that's one way they're approaching.
Very good point. Anybody want to comment on that?
I would just say, on the, I think the issue, we've been talking about rare disease and we talked about cancer, and we haven't really addressed the other elephant in the room, which is diseases that some people bring on, quote unquote, bring on themselves or increase the risks of. So Andy Dreyfus is the CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield in Massachusetts, and I know him because I coach his daughter in soccer. I don't travel in his lofty circles, but at a panel discussion in Boston, he said, we're delighted to pay. We're not delighted, but we don't argue with the payment for rare diseases and for cancer. 50% of our entire bill is 2% of patients who have, heart disease, obesity, smoking, and of all the lifestyle factors, not the hereditary factors, but lifestyle factors that produce enormous costs, lifetime costs. We would love to find a way out of that. So I think, by extension, maybe this objection is them finally putting the brakes on and saying, we aren't just going to pay for folks who are continuing to smoke and drink and eat too much. I don't know.
I mean, I think two other data points. That's a lifestyle-based situation, but Novartis with their MS drug Gilenya actually did a pilot program with Humana where they agreed to do a rebate for the number of months that they were able to keep the MS patient from relapsing out of the hospital. And yes, and so that has actually created an interesting model, and they're starting to have broader discussions. I think another data point, the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, last year came out with some language when they were starting to evaluate the CAR-Ts for immunotherapy for oncology. And what they said to, again, companies like Novartis was, we'll pay you $135,000 for this treatment to save this person's life, but we're going to sort of depreciate that or sort of adjust that if the person, dies within a 5-year period of time, which is, kind of a very strong approach to take, but it is starting to have those discussions around what's the value of saving a life and how do we, as a pharma company, sort of own up to the fact that maybe the drug didn't deliver as required. So it's an interesting time.
There have been a number of money-back guarantees. J&J had that kind of program with Velcade in the UK for Hodgkin's. In a prior company that I ran, we had money-back guarantees too. So if you die prematurely, you can come and get your money back. No, not really. No, so the idea being that if you buy a washing machine, it doesn't work properly, it doesn't do what's promised, you want to get it fixed or your money back. And I think in terms of healthcare outcomes, that's not an unreasonable demand to have. So there's only so far you can get with FDA approval, which is really around quality, safety, and efficacy. If you don't deliver on the promise, which kind of applies to a lot of things in our personal lives, right? If you don't deliver on the promise, there should be some form of payback for that.
Yeah, I have a question on the valuation of the startup companies, sort of the preclinical companies that have shown data on animal models. For like clinical companies, you can look at public comparables to arrive at a valuation, but for preclinical ones, how do you come up with a reasonable valuation and not to dilute yourself so much?
So I'm sure Ron's got tons of data on benchmarks.
Should he agree to disclose it?
That's right. So, yeah, preclinical data obviously has limited value. We've cured a lot of mice of cancer, but that doesn't necessarily translate into humans. That said, there have been a number of very big preclinical deals, significant size deals. An old mentor of mine was very fond of responding to the question of what's your company worth? And he used to say this: your company is worth what you say it's worth and what someone's prepared to pay for it. So there's no particular science to it. And like a lot of these things, it's a mix of art and science. Yeah.
So,
I would say that animal models have different degrees of predictability. In the two antibiotic companies I ran, we were able to sign a sort of $800 million biobuck deal with Sanofi for a gram-negative antibiotic at the discovery stage because the MICs were so potent against the worst MDR, Acinetobacter, and the Pseudomonas. And the next step is usually phase 1, where drugs can fall out, especially antibiotics, can fall out because of safety. But once you're past preclinical and phase 1, usually the risk is dramatically reduced relative to other indications. So I'd argue that it's sort of indication and class specific as well. But in MS, one of the top researchers used to say, my mother's apple pie worked in rat EAE, which was the model for MS at the time. It's like there was no predictability whatsoever. I don't know if you have a.
Yeah, I have no idea what your company might be about or sort of, yeah, it is.
$500 million,
Yeah.
absolutely.
$5,000. It is a challenge because it's really about sort of the forward plan of how much money you need to raise, how you're going to generate the data that are going to be needed to get you into the clinic and so on. So, and there's a lot of truth in what Mark said about sort of you don't want to overprice it. Yes, I recognize the dilution factor for founders and early investors, but also it can take you out of the game and getting future investment if you price it too high. Or you're forced to tell people, sorry, you've lost all your investment, right? And none of those are really good scenarios. So it is subject to negotiation. I think very often, I think if you get past the stage where people want to fund your company, you're rarely probably going to get the value you feel is there, but the fact that they're putting new money in and try to recognize what's your role, what's your sort of contribution to the company, those that you've put into the company around you play a part of that. But I think it's more about a financing model than being able to put a real tangible value on what you have because so much is unknown.
A mistake I made as my first CEO, one of many mistakes I made, was to really go to the mat on the valuation, and it didn't matter anywhere near as much as the quality of the money that was coming in.
So I'm going to go to Tom next.
So get back to Lorraine's question about precision medicine again. The goal is to identify the cause of a disease by genetics, and then to understand the mechanism by which the mutation causes the disease, and then develop a drug that addresses that mechanism. And a perfect example is the recent one with SMA, spinal muscular atrophy. It's the most prevalent childhood genetic disease, kills more children than any other childhood genetic disease. That was studied for many years in academia. NIH put a lot of money into this. In fact, one particular patient charity put a lot of money into this. Columbia developed animal models for that were very successful in the drug. A small company in California developed an antisense method, and all this was based on basic science, precision identification, and Biogen bought the project from this company for, I think it was $75 million. And they announced when it was, it works, it's very successful, and it's now in the market. And they announced that the first year treatment will be $750,000, and the second will be half that. And beyond that, who knows? But this is not a disease that's cured by this drug. This is a disease that as long as it's there, there's there are progressive improvements, but it's not, once the drug's gone, the problem will continue. So to me, that is a serious issue about orphan diseases, about precision medicine, and I've wondered what the panel thought about where that's going to go, and if we have to pay $750,000 for every precision medicine that's developed, we're going to be in trouble.
So I think that's Spinraza. Ionis, I think, was the small company that Biogen acquired. There is a government accountability office report being put together on orphan drugs. So I think what has happened is people have perhaps begun with some indications that are truly orphan and expanded and leveraged pricing inappropriately. So I think the gold rush that surrounded rare and orphan drugs is going to change. And I think we've spoken to pricing and what's reasonable. I guess we could argue that. I really wouldn't take the position that that is reasonable. But as Mark's former alma mater, he may have something to say about Biogen's philosophy around pricing these kinds of products.
No, I think it's the real innovator, the person that started this whole thing was the head of Genzyme, Henry Termeer, right? And Henry makes no apologies because he went after rare and ultra-rare diseases with Gaucher's was really the first big breakthrough, and charging X $100,000 a year. And the rest of us in Cambridge couldn't believe. We just thought this guy's dead on arrival. He's a walking dead. And he was able to get it through. And that for the last 20 years, everyone's been looking around saying, waiting for the music to stop. But I think the music is slowing down. I think that
I might also make a distinction between companies that are value creators and value extractors. Value creators do a lot of heavy scientific lifting, obviously invest a great deal in original R&D, and value extractors perhaps take other people's R&D and just squeeze on the price. So this is Turing, Valiant, Mallinckrodt, Horizon, Mylan, and at a
Marathon
thank
announced they
you.
were shutting down today because their feelings were hurt.
Well, and I don't know where they've been for the last year to price Emflaza at $89,000 with all the hoo-ha over pricing. But there's also that kind of more subterranean level. If you price at 9.9% a year, every year, or in some cases twice a year, that might not necessarily be appropriate, particularly if there's no new evidence, no new clinical trials, no new formulations, patient indications, and so on.
Hi, so, well, it's a little bit too loud. So say I've hit on something that really would deliver sort of high throughput target identification. I'm not really looking to go through, or I hope, to go through as little of the whole drug development process as possible, because I'm the sort of person who wants to sort of solve one problem and move on. So what's the best way to approach that? I mean, I'm imagining that I would be talking to someone like you about, okay, I've got this target, I've got this IP on it, I'll probably have a certain amount of data on it before I, present it to anyone. So what's the best way to sort of approach that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we had a research group at Yale, out of Yale. This was the Rybex that was founded by a Nobel laureate, Tom Stites, and the whole X-ray crystallography was the secret sauce. So we were able to come up with gram-negative prototypes that no one else had ever come, completely novel structures for antibiotics, which still is kind of the coin of the realm because they won't have any kind of resistance built up theoretically. So that's where we got the $800 million BioBucks deal, 20, 30 million up front, milestones. We were not ever going to sell it, right? So I think your model here potentially is if you have high throughput screening, you can either lease that to various people with some sort of payments for commercialized drugs, downstream milestones, or you can rent it, or you can sell it outright. But you know, there certainly is a model where everyone's delighted to take your wonderful machine and run with it, and you can go on to other things, you know.
Back row, and then we'll come up, if you don't mind,
Thank you. Dr. Durant, you said something early on that I found really interesting. You said that one of the things in your career you were most proud of was having created a culture in one of your companies that was, voted most outstanding or whatever. And that's particularly interesting because I know it's really difficult to create constructive management environments. I thought maybe you'd say a few words about that. Maybe some of the other folks too. And I guess wrapped into this is a little bit about leadership too. How did you manage to pull that off? And maybe some thoughts that you could share with others who know.
Sure. So there was a lot of intentionality that went into establishing a culture. If you're the founder or CEO or leader in an organization, a lot of that does emanate from you and how you operate and behave. From a whole number of surveys, people want leaders who are honest, consistent, and visionary. And consistency is important. People shouldn't guess if you're in a, quote, good mood. And it doesn't matter if you are or if you're not. You have to be even-tempered. So that kind of setting the stage is important. What we did in that organization was have a pretty simple way of how we went about things. So we had 5 behaviors, and people each had 5 objectives. So the objectives were what you did, and the behaviors were how you did them. And I'll recite those behaviors to you in a moment. But we also had a foundation stone rule. It was a simple rule, and I'd always talk with new hires about the rule. It was 2 words. And it was really, in this organization, here's our rule: no politics. So what does politics mean? We define that. So it might be claiming other people's work as your own. It might be undermining the decision after you'd agreed to it. It might be looking to sabotage someone who you saw as your competitor. We defined all this and had to call it out where it occurred. We also defined how it looked when people were so good at playing it that they wanted you to believe they weren't playing it. So I have no time for games and time wasting. That stuff just makes people burn so much emotional fuel that could be applied to doing the real work. And just one example of how we policed it. Didn't happen too often. But it might be in a meeting, I'd say, Joe, can we have a quick chat after the meeting? Sure. So we'd have one-on-one. So Joe, in the meeting, it looked like you were taking credit for Deborah's work. And my perception of you is that you were transgressing our rule and playing politics. Tell me how you feel about my perception of you right now. And then you just use silence and see how Joe feels about your perception right now. And it usually eradicated things. And people saw that we were serious. Our 5 behaviors: shared accountability and transparency, participative management, ongoing listening and learning, competitive benchmarking and improvement, and coaching and developing others. Those are the 5 behaviors. We then move to, okay, well, what's transparency about? It's, I think you know, which included, well, what does everyone earn? So we were a private company, but I published what we all earned, what the senior team earned. And then moved from appraisals, you know that annual complete waste of time where your boss and you haven't prepared, but you know you've got to do it because their boss said you've got to do it? We didn't do appraisals. We did reviews every so often. And so the supervisor's reward was not dictated by their supervisor. It was dictated by the people that reported to them or the people that they served. So they would assess whether people deserved the reward and would have a voice in that. And one other way we put that together, one of the leadership team said, I earn a lot less than everyone else. I had a look, yes, you do. Well, I'd like to earn more. Said, yes, you should. You tell me what you think you're worth, and we'll pay it. And then your people will review whether you're worth what you say you're worth. Adult, open, honest, no gaming, no BS. Try it sometime.
That's not how it works in pharma.
Which is why I am utterly unemployable in Big Pharma.
I'm curious what your thoughts are about the pros and cons of collaborations between small biotech and big pharma. I spent quite a few years working in oncology drug development at Novartis, and I'm now at a small biotech. And we're considering the pros and cons of doing further clinical development either on our own, which you're worried about your burn rate at the small biotech level, versus the restrictions and sometimes the time delays that are imposed by collaborating with big pharma. So I thought I would ask what your thoughts are about those pros and cons.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I understand those sort of concerns and, yeah, the pros and cons. It is hard to share information, and it's great to have someone help fund the work that you want to do and to get expert advice or at least guidance in where whoever the partner might be believes these are the critical experiments to do to get you to success. I think it is much easier today, I believe, in that environment than it used to be. I think it was much more of a sort of arm's length transaction and buy and sell transaction a number of years ago. I think today pharma recognizes that it needs novel opportunities from smaller companies, and we have to be good partners to help make that happen. And we recognize that we have to share fairly, we have to pay fairly, and share in the lifting along the way. And so I think that's why I kind of cite when we make investments in early stage companies, the money's nice and obviously critical to the small company, but to us it's more the mechanism through which we can then engage in a real open technical conversation about what it is you're interested in doing. So, I mean, it has to be good interpersonal fit. I think that's kind of the key element. Even the money is easy, relatively easy for the bigger company. It's about, is it a good fit? Are you going to help my company grow? Will we be able to get to the clinical studies faster or get the data? Or maybe because you've taken the burn off us for a particular program, we can focus our money on other things, but we can work together and learn together along the way. So it really depends on who it is you might consider working with, and are they open to that? I think if they're looking to take and not share, then I'd be wary of that as well.
Careful partner selection. Sorry, Mark.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Obviously, that's critical. Just about every big pharma says, we want to be the partner of choice. Very few say, we'd like to be the partner of last resort. However, some of the behaviors translate into that. Trying to understand how that chemistry works, most partnerships fall apart because there isn't alignment of shared objectives at a senior level that are then policed in a positive way. But when they are, they can offer tremendous additional value. You can really bulk out, as it were, your programs with the right partnership. And look, I think big pharma, whatever that is, has recognized that being a good partner and being excellent with alliance management is a competitive advantage. So seek out those enlightened partners.
I would say the one thing, you guys are absolutely right, the one thing to be watchful about is whether or not your champion in big pharma, when you do a deal, how much strength that person has, if he or she has the strength to withstand the slings and arrows of sort of competitive disparaging. Because every year, and usually more than once a year, but at least once a year, there's the whole program force ranking and resource allocation. It usually starts in May or June, and you remember, because you were there, and then and gets finalized somewhere in the iterations. And I've seen it where I was on the other side of this at Biogen when a program that we all believed in came in, and the clinical group had daggers out for it because it was taking resources away from one of their pet in projects. And you know, having been the biological child in big pharma, the stepchildren come in and it's like, no, I just don't see it. So there's lots of different specious reasons they'll come up with, like, no, I just think they're sort of a rehash. So got to be wary of whether or not you have that consistent champion, because you could wind up 2 years into a 4-year deal suddenly being, well, we don't think there's a step forward here. Why? We did everything you said. Well, it turns out your senior VP that really championed the deal now just went to Pfizer, right? Right. You know, so.
My question is the version of what keeps you awake at night, but I guess what keeps you awake at night in light of some of the regulatory changes, reduction in easing in regulatory impediments with the new politics out there. Ultimately, probably some change in the Affordable Care Act or whatever the next iteration is, potential reduction in NIH funding, and repatriation of dollars, and maybe, Ron, that applies more to you, in terms of money that's overseas that's probably going to come home with some easing there. How does all of this stuff start to change what your bigger picture issues are and how it changes things moving forward over the next 5-10 years in your space?
I think the two things that, to me, the biggest two things year in and year out are investment levels in biotech, which are, because biotech is always the canary in the coal mine. It's the last to get funded after the economic cycle gets solid, and it's one of the first to go when the economic cycle goes bad. So investment, continued investment, without which we saw in 2009 to 2013 virtually no IPOs, seed companies that could have, that's 5 years worth of innovation that just mostly was the dark ages. It all died. Some of those ideas will never come back, and they should, but they got lost. The other, which I'm always watching daily, is the FDA, right? FDA's no disrespect to the people who work there, but it's a broken organization, right? There's senior people. They will never tell you this. There's 30 or 40% open positions in middle management because if the junior people come on board, they get some experience and they move on. And I'm totally sympathetic to the people who work there because they are whipsawed by Congress back and forth. Every time there's a drug or something that goes wrong, they parade one of these deputy directors up and they crucify them. And that happened in 2006 with one of the drugs, antibiotics. And when we came to the advisory committee in 2008, there was no leadership in antibiotics. There was an ophthalmologist running infectious disease. 4 life-saving antibiotics came into one committee meeting, advisory committee. They all died. They're all on the market now, but there was 5 or 6 years where they weren't. So I think that to me, it's investment and it's FDA. Those are the things that can either help or kill our industry in the short term.
I guess my quick comments there, I think if there is a tax holiday of sorts, I think that's good for our entire industry, all industries, frankly. I can't envision it's going to be permanent, but I think it gives us all more resources, and I don't think we're looking, some companies will return that to shareholders, but I think many are looking to sort of enhance their business prospects. So, and I can't envision, I think we all understand the politics behind and the response to inversions. I don't know how that's going to play out. I can't envision that getting any better. But I think if tax policy is revised in the US, that will help all of us, small and large companies. So we all want to keep jobs here. We want to create jobs here. So I think those are all positives. I don't see any change. If anything, I think it's good, it's challenging, but it's good that the pricing pressures have been raised, and I don't see those going away. I would agree that I think, there's speculation in the press that regulatory approval processes will get easier or will be weakened in some way. I don't believe that. Cynicism, I think, but it sure could be improved.
So at a micro level, I worry about financing and keeping the company and companies that I'm involved in viable and just keeping the doors open. That's a constant concern, and it's relentless. At a more macro level, and maybe at the risk of sounding a little bit syrupy, we are all in some way, shape, or form involved in healthcare and improving the human condition. And that is a very noble calling. I am personally deeply concerned about how politically, and not just in this country, but in many other countries, science and the regard in which science should be held is being eroded. That deeply concerns me, and some of the behaviors that we're seeing in various places.
And if you could just join me in giving a nice round of applause for him.